So we're going to bring Dr. Kaklamani on to start us off, and then we will welcome Sheila and Julia. So thank you, Dr. Kaklamani.
Jean, thank you so much, and thank you to all the LBBC staff. You guys are doing an absolutely amazing job, and it's my honor to be part of this program today. So my task today was to talk about clinical trials, and this is something that is near and dear to my heart. So why do we need clinical trials? Well, we are where we are today because of clinical trials, because of brave men and women before us who participated in clinical trials that really defined what the standard of care treatments are going to be. We develop new and better treatments through clinical trials, but we also develop safe treatments through clinical trials. We find markers of response. We find the best screening strategies. So clinical trials really are needed for any progress in any disease, including breast cancer. So a lot of times we have misconceptions as to all of these new drugs that come along, and how long does it take for these drugs to really become our standard of care option. So everything starts typically from a hypothesis. Somebody, whether they work for a drug company, or whether they work at a university, or whether they get their ideas from patients, or whether patients have their own ideas, they come up with a hypothesis. And then we do a lot of laboratory studies, which are called the preclinical studies. And these start from cells, and they go to animals, and then bigger animals. And then we have these first in human studies, and those are very tough, right? These are drugs that we've never tested on men and women before, and now we are. And subsequent to that, we start going through different phases that I'll go through in detail. And then finally, we get, hopefully, an FDA approval of a specific medication. And this path will take 15 to 20 years. So you can imagine how long that process is, and how many drugs have failed, and how many drugs have failed wrongfully because of some glitch and something that we never really found out. So many ways that some of these drugs may not make it to clinic, but the lucky ones will do, but it'll take 15 to 20 years to do so. So there are different types of clinical trials, and this is very important for us to know as patients and as physicians, so that we understand what the clinical trial is about and whether this is the right clinical trial for us. Phase 0 clinical trial is really a phase where the drug, we test whether the drug will even get to the tumor and how the drug acts in our body. This is a relatively rare trial. I don't think you will be encountering it much. Phase 1 clinical trial is a little bit more common. That's where we find the right dose of the drug, and we get preliminary information on how well it works, but we also assess what the side effects, what the adverse events are of that specific drug. Phase 1 clinical trials can also be clinical trials of drugs that we've already tested, but now we're combining them, and we're trying to figure out again how well this combination works. We don't really look at phase 1 clinical trials to decide whether this drug is an efficacious drug, whether it works, but we do want to make sure that this drug has some activity in that phase 1 trial. Phase 2 trials are the trials where we get preliminary efficacy, meaning that we get preliminary results on how well this drug works. Now, a lot of companies are using these phase 2 clinical trials even to go to the FDA and try to get approval of their drugs. So these phase 2 trials may not include a lot of patients. They may include anywhere between 20 to 100, 150 patients. But these trials tell us whether this is a worthy drug, a drug where we want to invest a lot more time and a lot more money and a lot of patients to go into the phase 3 trials. The phase 3 trials are the trials where we typically compare the standard of care to the drug or the drug combination that we now want to be testing. These are the trials that mostly the FDA will look at to decide whether a drug is worth approving or not. And then the phase 4 trials are the post-marketing trials. Those are trials where the drug's already approved, but the FDA still wants the drug company to do research on the drug to make sure that that we haven't missed anything. And these are extremely important because you have all seen drugs that are pulled from the market because a new toxicity came up that we didn't know before. And this came up from those phase 4 post-marketing trials. So, a couple of things to keep in mind about clinical trials. All clinical trials are voluntary, and this is extremely important. Nobody should be coerced into participating in a clinical trial. This is unethical, illegal, and has huge ramifications. So they're voluntary. Besides studying treatments, some of these clinical trials can also study ways to detect cancer, to diagnose it early, to learn the extent of the disease. So all of these studies don't necessarily look at drugs. They can look at devices as well. Not all clinical trials study drugs. They can study other treatments. They can study surgery. They can study radiation. They can study a combination of these. So remember, any kind of research that involves a patient is going to be considered a clinical study and or a clinical trial. So the most important thing now is this clinical trial the right thing for the patient that we have in front of us, for all of you? A clinical trial is used to determine whether therapy is safe and is effective. So, but there's different types of clinical trials. There are the treatment trials where we're looking at a specific treatment. There are prevention trials where we're trying to see if a medication or if a procedure can help prevent cancer. Screening trials where we try to see if a screening strategy works. And quality of life trials. Is the quality of life of our patient impacted because of the treatments that we have available for them? Extremely important in this process is that the patient and the physician work as a team, but the patient is as active a participant on this team as the physician is, and the patient has to take control of their clinical trials as well. And so looking at websites, familiarizing yourself with clinical trials that are available are extremely important. I love it when a patient comes and says, is there a clinical trial for me? Or look at this clinical trial. Is this the right clinical trial for me? Or where can I go and learn more about clinical trials? This tells me that the patient is invested in their care as much as I'm invested in their care. There's a website that the National Cancer Institute has put together called clinicaltrials.gov, where every clinical trial has to be registered on that website. So if you go on the website, there's a patient and a physician website. You can log on and you can put in a word, breast cancer, stage 4 breast cancer, lobular stage 4 breast cancer, or any other search criterion that you want. You can put in where you live and how many miles you're willing to travel, and it'll give you all of the clinical trials available in that area. Now, this may be a little hard for some people to look through and decide whether a trial is important or not, but that's where it's important to share those results with your physician and have them look at them and say, I think this is not worthy, but I think this is a great trial. I think this may be good in the future for us. Let's keep this in our minds. So this is very important for all of you to remember. Look at the clinical trials yourselves. Make sure that if there is a clinical trial available, and if this is the right trial for you, that you get to know about it. So, important thing about educating patients about clinical trials. It's never the right time. When do we familiarize our patients about the clinical trial? Is it when they're diagnosed and they're really overwhelmed with their diagnosis, and all of a sudden we say, hey, by the way, if we talk to you about clinical trials, please don't shut down. This may be a good thing for you. Is it when the cancer is progressing? Well, again, they're pretty overwhelmed. Is it when everything looks great and the treatment is working and the patient is doing well? Well, then the patient may feel that we are waiting for the other shoe to drop. There's never the right time to talk about clinical trials, but it's always important to bring them up. So this has to be a very delicate conversation and really a very informative conversation with our patients. We have to discuss what the trial is, what phase the trial is. There's misconceptions about placebo. Everybody will say, Am I going to get an active drug or am I going to get placebo? For cancer trials, we don't do trials where a patient only gets placebo when they have metastatic breast cancer. We just don't do that. Ethically, we cannot afford to do that. And so there's always some treatment. What are the alternatives? Very important. If I don't participate in this clinical trial, what are my other options? What are the risks when I participate on this clinical trial? And then how do I go through a consent form that is typically more than 25 pages long? And these consent forms are forms that we have to put together based on all of the FDA requirements. So this is very hard and very hard for the patient and their family to look at, but very important as well. Trials take time. And we have to realize that as physicians too. If I talk to a patient of mine about a clinical trial, I know that that visit is not going to be a 15 or 20-minute visit. It's probably going to be a 45-minute visit. And my clinic time doesn't allow me to do that. But I have to do that because it's important for my patient. It's important for breast cancer as well. Trials take knowledge. We have to know what this trial is about. Our patients know very well if we're starting to look at a consent form, we don't know what we're talking about. How can we ethically incentivize patients? And how can we ethically incentivize physicians to participate on those clinical trials? And do the trials benefit our patients? But something to keep in mind always is that study after study has shown that patients enrolling in clinical trials have an improvement in their overall survival compared to patients that don't participate in clinical trials. So it's actually a good thing if you participate in a clinical trial. Studies have shown that women participating in trials live longer. So if a physician brings up a clinical trial to you, what are the questions that you should be asking? First of all, who is the sponsor of the trial? Does the physician have any vested interest in this clinical trial? What is the phase of the trial? Is this an early phase trial, a phase 1 trial, or is this a phase 3 trial? Where is the trial being done? Is it done at this institution? Is it going to be easy for the patient to participate in this clinical trial? Why do I want to participate on this trial? What is it for me? What do I have to lose if I participate on this trial? What is the cost and the benefit of participating on this clinical trial? What are my expectations? And could I get a placebo? Is there a crossover? There's always a question about what this crossover means. A lot of times when we do a trial, we look at 2 drugs, but what we also look at is whether the sequence of giving these drugs makes a difference. If I give drug A first and then drug B, am I going to get a better result than if I give drug B first and then drug A? So sometimes many trials will allow a crossover. So if you are enrolled in a trial and you get drug A, after that drug stops being effective, you might be allowed to cross over to drug B. So these are the sort of trials called the crossover trials, and that's important to know. Do I know what group I'm going to be, or is this a blinded trial? Blinded trial is where a computer decides where I go, but I don't know, and my physician also doesn't know what arm of the trial I'm going to be on. And if that's the case, can I find out later on what arm of the trial I was on? Those are questions we always want to be asking. And what are my other options? If I don't want to be on this clinical trial, what are my options for treatment? What are the side effects that I might expect? What is the cost? Do I have to pay for something? Does the clinical trial pay for it? Does my insurance pay for it? Very important questions to always keep in mind. But with all of this, I think what's important to remember is that we will never be able to cure breast cancer unless we do clinical trials. So it's very important that we select the right trials. It's very important that the trial is the right one for us, but it's also very important to realize that these trials are going to help other women ahead of us, the same way that women before us helped us with participating on these clinical trials. So I'll finish with that. I know that we're going to have a lot of questions and a great discussion. And again, I appreciate the invitation today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaklamani. We are getting a lot of great questions into the queue. I'm going to bring back Sheila and Julia, and I'm going to bring on my colleague Janine. Janine and I will manage the questions together. Thank God, I'm very happy to have her with me. But let's start off with a question that I think all of you will have something to say about, which is what we're hearing from some of the questions is too often either doctors don't mention a trial or they only talk about trials that are available in their institution. And then also some doctors look at trials as a last resort as opposed to sort of getting that thinking earlier in the process. So Dr. Kaklamani, maybe you could respond first, and then Sheila and Julia, feel free to jump in.
So obviously the trials that we have in our institutions we're more familiar with. And we also realize that patients may not be able to travel to another city to participate in a clinical trial. But it's very easy to find those clinical trials. If you go on clinicaltrials.gov and you say 50 miles, let's say, you'll find all of the different clinical trials that are going on. And really, it's our responsibility to know the trials that are happening in our region. Websites of all institutions have clinical trials that are available. Again, it might be hard to navigate, but it's definitely something that should happen. And clinical trials should not be a last resort. Now, if this is a phase 1, a first in human clinical trial, that's a little bit of a different story. But please don't think that if a physician mentions a clinical trial to you, it's because they think that it's either the trial or hospice, because that is a mistake. Many of these clinical trials are clinical trials where patients live for many years after they participate on that trial. They could be early stage trials.
Great. Sheila or Julia?
Well, as Jean said, I was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer December 2nd of 2009. And in December 2018, I progressed for the 4th time. And I decided then, it wasn't a last resort, as the doctor said, but I decided to get on a clinical trial. And I thought it was important for the Black community as well to see that it's okay to be on a trial. That's one thing that, I always talk to my doctor about. It's like, well, you have to consider what Black people went through when you're introducing a clinical trial to a patient, especially a Black patient. So when she introduced it to me, we've always talked about it. And the first thing I did say was, am I going to be a guinea pig? Like, what's going on? And she said, no, Sheila, she explained it to me step by step by step. And I was like, okay, but I wanted her to understand where I was coming from as well. And she did. And she explained it, and she brought in a clinical trial coordinator, and we talked about it. And I was like, let's go for it, because I want Black women and men to see that this is okay. And there are many more steps in place to not have the same things happen to us as we did years ago. So I was on a clinical trial for 3 years and 5 months, but I had to get off of it in November of 2021. It wasn't because of progression. It was because I caught, at the end of November, around Thanksgiving, I caught COVID pneumonia. I don't know where it came from, somewhere. And one of the side effects from the trial was lung disease. So my doctor's like, no, it's only a 16% chance, but we don't want to take that risk with you. So that's when I got off the trial. So I just think that, as Kelly, my friend, said on here, I'm looking at the chat, she said, advocates should be involved with trials from beginning to end, and it should be a diverse patient advocate board, or have us on board. So we're the ones receiving this treatment, so we need to learn about it. I think those that I was on Herceptin for 8.5 years. Somebody had to be on a clinical trial for me to, for it to work for me. So, I think all clinical trial participants. And, I was glad I was on it. Actually, it was FDA approved, and I was still on the trial portion. And actually, my doctor said the next 3 months I could probably get back on it. So clinical trials, this is top-notch research, and we need it.
Thank you, Sheila. Julia, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll add that unfortunately, not every doctor is like Dr. Kaklamani or Dr. Ma. So I think one of the big gaps is that it's put on the patients. This need to search for the trials or decide if you are going to go on the trial, and in the current system where each institution has their trials and they mostly know their own trials and probably also want the patient to stay on their trials because they chose to have that trial because they believe in it. So they I think what we need as a country is a decentralized way to put people in trials. In addition to the whole like accessing trials from other places, but there should be a navigator that's not associated with any institution helping a patient to find the right trial for them, not related to where the person is currently being treated. I think that's something that's really missing.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks for adding that. In follow-up to that, Dr. Kaklamani, are there initiatives going on now to make changes to the clinical trial system? We have a couple of people who are saying that they're having difficulty finding trials because they live in rural areas or in areas where there's not a lot of clinical trials. So if you could just talk a little bit about the work that's being done and the ways that people can access trials now.
So we've been living in a pandemic for the past 2+ years, and I always believe that every time we have a challenge, we also have an opportunity, and we've taken the opportunity from COVID to learn on how to help patients and help physicians do things remotely. And this also includes clinical trials. So our clinical trials have been a little bit easier, not everyone, but the FDA has loosened some of the requirements for these clinical trials so that if you need to see your doctor and you don't need a physical exam, you can do a televisit. If you need to have blood work, you don't have to go into the hospital. You can do it in a local place close to home, and those results will be transferred to the clinical trial facility. So it's making things a little bit easier. By no means very, very easy. So Julia's point is extremely important, that I wish we had one humongously big clinical trials office where every, not just institution, but every one physician group in the country could access and say, this is the trial that I want. Logistics make it extremely hard. Each trial has its own database. For these databases, we have to spend 20 to 30 minutes every few months getting trained as physicians to be able to sign things that other people are putting in. The pharmacies need to be aware of how to get the drug. The nurses have to be trained to administer a drug. So it's very, very hard for this to be achieved, but I'm hoping that it will, because you're right. It's very common that a patient will ask me, is there a clinical trial for me? And I will say, I don't have one. And the closest place that does is 3 hours away. And the patient will say, I cannot afford to do that. So I'm hoping that these barriers at some point will go down, because we need them. Only 2 to 5% of patients participate in clinical trials. Imagine if that was 10%, how much progress we would have made. Not to mention the fact that, like Sheila said, that when we look at underserved communities, when we look at Blacks and Hispanics, the number of Blacks and Hispanics participating in clinical trials is extremely small, which means that all of the results that we're getting are for white people. So if a Black patient says to me, do you know that this drug will have the exact same reaction to me? I'll say, no, I don't. And this is extremely important, and we have to do better.
Very well said, Dr. Kaklamani. Sheila, it's so true. And 2%, I don't know the statistic, Dr. Kaklamani, but what is the percentage with pediatric cancers? It's much higher.
It's higher.
Yeah.
It's higher. It's higher.
Yeah, so women really need to step up and participate. So one question, well, we have a lot of questions, but the next question, Dr. Kaklamani, someone is asking, what if their current treatment seems to be working, like the progression is slowing? Should they think about moving to a clinical trial at that point, or when is the time you start thinking about it?
Well, you always want to think about it. Like Sheila said, in her course, she thought about clinical trials. She may not have participated, but she thought about it. But then there's the right time and I always say, don't try to fix something that's not broken. If treatment's working, you keep going. Now, if there's toxicities, that's a different story. But I don't change treatments unless they fail us. And once that treatment has failed us, then it may be the right time to look at a clinical trial. What I try to do, because as I'm sure many of you know, it doesn't take a day to go on a clinical trial. It takes several weeks. And those several weeks can be, shortened a little bit by us preparing ourselves for that trial. So if I know that a patient's cancer is slowly progressing, and I have a clinical trial, I'll talk to my coordinator and I'll say, hey, look at things. What do I need to do so that when that cancer progresses and if the patient agrees to go on that trial, we can get her on as quickly as possible.
That's why everybody wants to be your patient. You have a lot of people who want to sign up to see you. Just a quick add-on to that, because this is something I think women are concerned about. If you move to a trial, what is the role of your current medical oncologist?
So that depends. I always involve, if I have a patient that comes to me from the community about a clinical trial, I always involve the primary physician. You want to have a physician that is close to home, that is responsible for you. You want to have the physician that knows you the most, continue to be an active participant in your care. And so the treatments that are not part of that clinical trial, I try to encourage our patients to get them with that physician. And obviously I communicate with them and let them know every time there's a scan, every time there's a visit, this is what's going on, so that when we stop that trial, that physician takes over seamlessly without having to be re-educated about the patient. This is a little more common with phase 1 trials because many of the institutions have dedicated phase 1 groups. And so then the phase 1 group takes over, but the patient all of a sudden gets a new physician that they don't know, they have never trusted. And it's important for that patient to realize that the physician that they've been seeing for the past 10 years is still there.
And I do want to say too, Jean, when I was on my clinical trial, they couldn't do nothing without my oncologist, like even dose reduction or I had nausea or whatever. It was like, okay, we got to check with your doctor first. So it was important for me to see that she was very involved with every single, from my 6-week scans to whatever. And I was, like Dr. Kaklamani said, it meant a lot to me that she was very, very involved. And like I said, she's the one that said, no, we're going to take you off. So.
Thanks, Sheila. So our next question, I'm going to direct this toward both Dr. Kaklamani and Julia and Sheila. It's about the costs and benefits to a person who participates in a clinical trial. So some of the things this person is concerned about are the hassle of having more appointments and tests. You get closer monitoring for early warning of disease progression. So Julia, why don't we start with you? If you could talk a little bit in your view, the things that you see are potential costs and benefits to a person in a clinical trial.
Yeah, so participating in a clinical trial is very expensive. Like Dr. Kaklamani said, you might have to travel, you have more visits. I mean, that's like $10, $15 at a lot of these big cities in parking just to get there. For one day in parking, you pay that much. And then people have lives, so they have to leave their jobs, they have to get childcare and all of those things. And it's, I think until the recent past, it has been something that patients have not been helped which is a huge problem. And some of the arguments for that are related to what she also said, which is like you can't influence someone in participating in a clinical trial. So there's this fear that if you give people money to participate in a clinical trial, you're trying to pull them into participating. And no one's going to participate in a clinical trial because you're giving them some hours of childcare, right? Or because you're giving them a voucher for lunch. So I think now we're slowly getting over this and accepting that it's not payment for participating in clinical trials, just reimbursement for the costs that people already have. And importantly, if you don't do that, if you don't level this playing field, the people that are able to participate are the ones that are wealthy, have the time, have the ability to travel, have support, and that's the data you're going to have in a clinical trial. And that's not everyone that has cancer and needs to receive treatment.
Thanks, Julia. And Sheila, since you had done a clinical trial, what was your experience? Were there things that showed up as barriers or costs that you weren't anticipating? Some of the things that Julia mentioned?
No, I was very fortunate because I was in the military, and the military basically, took care of everything that I needed. But I didn't know that they were giving me this at the beginning, but they did give me $25 voucher and lunch. And they knew, have my vouchers when I come, because, it was important to me. It was just the little things. But I also hear people say, well, I can't afford the $15 in parking, And something $15 to me might be something different for a person, that actually can't afford the $15. But they also gave free parking, for participating in a clinical trial, or even if you were in a treatment center, you got free parking. But I do hear people have to travel distances. I always say Black women, 70% of Black women are single parents, so childcare might be something important to them, or a copay or anything, well, I got to put food on my table, or am I going to participate in this clinical trial where I got to travel an hour and a half or 2 hours? So we just need to make it accessible to everyone. And even the cost. I just don't think that, I hope people don't believe that, okay, if I participate in this trial, I'm going to get this money, but it also helps people, tremendously to basically save their lives. So I think it's important that we, like I said, continue to see what the patient needs, even introducing a clinical trial. Okay, what do you need? I make sure my doctor know, okay, I have a daughter, I have a dog. I want you to know me. I want you to know me first as a person and then as a patient, because we partners in this. Like, you saving my life, so we got to work on this. So, I wanted her to know me as a person, first, and know my needs and wants. And from the 6 week I had for 3 years, I had a scan every 6 weeks. Every 2 months, I had my eyes checked. Every 2 months, I had my heart checked. I was there for 9 to 12 hours. But what about the people that are single parents that can't stay there for 9 to 12 hours, but have to decide on this clinical trial? So I just think that we have to take everything into consideration, especially, like I said, in underserved communities, not only in Black communities, but Latino communities and LGBT and Asian communities, for everybody, so.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Dr. Kaklamani, is there anything more you want to add before Jean asks our next question?
I couldn't agree more. The one thing that we have to balance is, and it came when I gave my kind of initial comments, is we cannot show that we are coercing patients, right? So, or in any way helping them make a decision to participate in a clinical trial by paying them. So this is where our institutional review board, the IRB, which looks at the ethics of a clinical trial, comes in and says, you know what, this payment is okay because it's $50 or $100, and it makes sense because the time that the patient has to come in is longer, the parking has to be included, or whatever it is, and that's ethical. But if you want to pay them $200, they will say no. this is a little too much. This does not explain the cost that the trial takes. And now we're kind of incentivizing patients by giving them money, and we don't want to do that. We cannot do that ethically. But it is a fine balance because, as Sheila mentioned, $15 for one person is very different for $15 to another person.
Great. I just want to, I'm sure you're all looking at the chat. I'm just so impressed with all of you. You have so much to learn from everybody. So they're pointing you to a lot of good resources, as well as if some of you want to connect afterwards, we can help facilitate that. Dr. Kaklamani, I just want to switch the focus a little bit to people who may have been on some trials and they're sort of coming to the point where the drugs are no longer working and looking towards getting drugs off label or actually trying to use the right to try law, which we know was passed a year ago. And I'm curious to know if Julia and Sheila have any advice to share. We have done that a little bit at LBBC, and it's certainly complicated. So Dr. Kaklamani, if you want to start.
Yes. So I use off-label drugs all the time. I always explain it to my patients. I always explain the rationale. And then, I hope that the insurance companies will approve them. I hope that they will, the people reviewing will not see all of the details and the drug will go past the review. I think this is the art of medicine. I think this is where clinical trials have limitations because we cannot do a clinical trial in every single tiny little scenario. And this is where we just have to use our brains and we have to use the knowledge from these clinical trials to extrapolate the data and realize whether some treatment might be good for our patients. And also remember, drugs take, even when we have a clinical trial available and the results available, it takes six months to a year for the FDA to approve that drug. So what happens in the meantime? If that drug is available for a different indication, do we not give it to our patients because the FDA is still reviewing it? Or do we try to give it? And I try to give it if I think that the results are compelling enough to do that. And I think that that's important to do. And again, there are phase 1 trials that in that scenario where a lot of the drugs are not working anymore might be worth for the patient revisiting. We have programs that drug companies set up, compassionate use programs, where when a drug has not really been approved yet, but the data is really good and we're waiting for the FDA, the drug company might give us that drug compassionately for our patients so that we can give it to them, even though the drug is not out in the market. And we have to take advantage of all of these situations.
Sheila or Julia, do you have any insight to share about the right to try law?
So what I understand, I've never actually personally dealt with it, but I understand that it was something that already existed to some extent. Like people already had ways to get access to drugs, so that it didn't change very much. I don't think that I think the data shows that not many people have actually used the right to try way to get drugs because like Dr. Kaklamani said, the expanded
compassionate use.
Yeah. And I'll just add that so patients that can't get, like the trial already closed and they can benefit from a drug, that's one way that they can try to get the pharmaceutical company to give the drug. And another case is when patients don't qualify for the trial for some reason, and those patients can't get the drug on the trial, and that might be a way for the patient to get the drug as well.
Thank you, Julia. I wanted to just jump in here because we have a couple of folks who are newly diagnosed and would really appreciate if we could define some of the terms we're using. So if one of you could explain what an off-label medication is, maybe Dr. Kaklamani, if you want to do that, and what is the law right now for using a medication in that way? Like, why? Can you explain that?
Absolutely. So a medication is approved by the FDA for a very specific indication. And if you look at how the FDA words the indication, it's really very specific. It has to do with the type of cancer, obviously. It has to do with the stage of the cancer. It has to do with the scenario, the setting. Is this first line treatment, second line treatment, third line treatment? And this really is based on how the drug was approved, what the clinical trial data was for that drug. So if we have to prescribe a drug, we typically have to prescribe it on label, which means based on the results of these clinical trials. And this is for efficacy reasons, so how well the drug works, and safety reasons as well. How safe this drug is for that specific group of patients, because that's where it was studied. But a lot of times we have limitations in our data. We know that as Julia mentioned, some patients may not qualify for a clinical trial because of how that clinical trial was initially conducted. And in most cases, advocates were not included or not listened to enough. And so the criteria that were set by the drug companies were too strict. But we know that in real life, we see patients that don't meet those criteria, and those are our patients, and they need to benefit from these drugs. And so then we can make exceptions, and it's mostly a payer issue. If the insurance company says, no, we're not going to allow this we're not going to pay for this medication because that's not how it was approved. But for us, we mostly have to write a long note, which we love doing, to explain why we're doing this, and to also explain that we discuss this with our patient, and our patient is in agreement with the fact that this is an off-label use. And so once that's done, and again, obviously, as long as the insurance company agrees, then we can prescribe the medication.
Thanks for addressing that, Dr. Kaklamani. Jean, do you have the next question?
Can I just
Go ahead,
say-
Sheila.
I'm actually on a biosimilar for Herceptin, and it's like what Dr. Kaklamani said. It's 5 approved for Herceptin, and I didn't know, and because I'm on a committee for that. But that's a good question that doctors also need to explain these terms to us, because when I went in, she was like, oh, you're getting a biosimilar. I was like, well, my doctor didn't tell me that, so I freaked out. And because I'm like, is this the same thing? Is it going to work? And, called my doctor. She was like, yes, Sheila, I wouldn't have did it if it's not, I'll explain it to you. But I already knew what a biosimilar was. So, and even the word stable, I remember when my doctor first told me I was stable, I started crying because I didn't know what it was. And she was like, no, Sheila, that's good. That's good. You're not progressing. That's what we want to see. You're not progressing. So it would be nice maybe to have a term of books or something for newly diagnosed patients to take with them into their doctors. That's a good idea. I might come up with that. But to take in with their patients. So that's a good question.
Yeah, and we do have a lot of those resources, but since you brought up biosimilars, and there's probably people saying, what's a biosimilar? Dr. Kaklamani, are you okay just giving the, because I know insurance companies are changing what they'll pay for.
So it's like the generic. So instead of getting the Bayer's aspirin, you're going to get the generic aspirin. And guess what? The studies that were done on Bayer's aspirin were a lot more extensive than the studies being done with the generic. And the regulation from the FDA is very different too. So the biosimilar was approved based on one clinical trial that compared it to Herceptin in a specific scenario, and it seemed like it worked the same. But we haven't tested it in every single scenario. And so, but the only reason we use them is because the insurance companies come in and say, Herceptin costs too much money. So now we will only approve the biosimilar. But they work the same. But if you ask me to show you exactly the data, I wouldn't be able to, because it doesn't exist.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you asked that you mentioned that, Sheila, because one of our participants actually asked the question about whether physicians are required to tell you if they swap out a medicine, either on a clinical trial or if it's a similar medicine like a biosimilar, which is biologically similar, because she's experiencing more side effects from this replaced medication that she's gotten. So are physicians required to explain that, Dr. Kaklamani?
I don't think that we are. When we do the consenting, we don't say Herceptin, we say trastuzumab. And so trastuzumab is the generic name that is included in the biosimilars. And we don't even know when we've met with our patient. We put our orders in as Herceptin. And then the coordinators call the company and try to get it approved. And then we get an email saying, hey, by the way, Herceptin was not approved, but such and such was approved. So we're going to change the order for you. And then I go, okay. And I typically, first of all, forget because this happens multiple times a day. So I can't remember in what patient what was approved. And secondly, I don't typically see the patient until they're already receiving their treatment. And you're right, there is a difference. I remember a patient a long time ago was on anastrozole, which is an aromatase inhibitor that we use for estrogen positive breast cancer. And the one side effect that it causes is achiness, stiffness in the joints. And she was on the brand name, and then the insurance said, we're not paying for the brand name. So she went to the pharmacy to pick up the medication, and the pharmacist said, you're getting the generic. And all of a sudden she took the generic and she didn't have any stiffness. So she calls me back and she goes, I don't think this is working. And she actually, I had to write a new prescription that said Arimidex to make sure, and she would pay out of pocket, and she was fine with it, to make sure that she actually got the brand name because she didn't think that the generic was working.
That's a question that it just popped up in the chat, actually, that if you want the brand name, is that something you're able to get because of side effect reasons? Sounds like you can, and I know you can often, petition your insurance company and all these things. Again, we put a lot of burden on patients to do all of these things, but that is another path. Janine, do you want to?
Sure. Dr. Kaklamani, during your presentation, you mentioned that people who are on clinical trials live longer than people who are not on clinical trials. Can you explain what the reasons might be for that?
So first of all, as Julia mentioned, we select our patients pretty carefully for clinical trials. They have to have a good performance status. They have to have a good liver function tests, and so they're really the cream of the crop. And we do this because the drug companies are afraid that if they give a drug that has side effects and the patient's not doing very well even before that clinical trial, then they may do even worse and have worse outcomes. So that's probably one reason. But the biggest reason is most of our clinical trials are successful because we have vetted them so much. And so when you go on a treatment where you live longer because of that new treatment, then obviously you're going to live longer. And then many patients that participate in one trial will participate in the second one and a third one. And so that also helps explain why women have better outcomes if they participate in clinical trials. And they get monitored more closely. They get scans every 6 weeks instead of every 3 months. They get seen more often by physicians. They get more blood tests. They have 2 physicians typically and 2 study coordinators hovering over them. So they honestly get more detailed care.
And I guess the other potential benefit is that they are helping the next person, right? You are advancing science and maybe giving an option. As Sheila said, she benefited from Herceptin. We all know we needed a lot of people to do those trials. Sheila, I want to bring this question to you, but everybody else could. We have a participant who lives in Alabama, so certainly really gets the horrible Tuskegee trials, Henrietta Lacks situation, and just wanting to know what more can organizations and individuals do to kind of overcome this horrible history and get more Black people to participate in clinical trials.
I think it's just more of bringing resources into underserved communities, doing what we're doing now, talking about it, having Black patients, on trials like this, showing actual patients who are on clinical trials. I always, when I talk to my doctor, I was like, okay, they give you this big blue bag when you're diagnosed with breast cancer, and you have to sit in this room and it's a video. So why not do a PSA on clinical trials? Have real patients talking about clinical trials. So that thought process is there. I know you're not really paying attention, because I wasn't, because I was just like, I got breast cancer, I don't want to sit here and watch this video. But the thought process is there. Then you can go back and say, hey, maybe down the road I can participate in a clinical trial. And I just think that what we're doing now, we got a long way to go. And I just think that is just bringing the resources to the community, continue educating, having doctors, being your own advocate. And there are a lot of amazing advocates out here, whether it doesn't take a Black person to go into a Black community to talk about clinical trials. We know that, our churches, you meet people where they are, have health fairs, recommend health fairs and different things like that, or even recommend LBBC. Hey, I'm going to this conference, girl, we're going to talk about clinical trials. Because I found out about Kadcyla from Living Beyond Breast Cancer. And I took it back to my doctor, and I said, well, I heard about this at Living Beyond Breast Cancer. Can I get on it? And she said, yeah, that was years ago, in 2012. So it's just about just continually educating, and just know that there are a lot of things that are different than years ago of what Black patients went through. So.
Sheila, this reminds me of one of my just most lovely patients when I was in Chicago. She was Black, and I had put her on one clinical trial, and then eventually her cancer progressed, and we talked about a second clinical trial. And she had been my patient for years, so this was not me meeting her for the first time. And she came back when she was getting started on the trial. She said, I went to church the other day, and they said to me, are you crazy? You're going to be on these clinical trial? And I said, no, I trust my doctor, and I'm going to be on that clinical trial. So we need advocates too. First of all, we as physicians need to understand the history, and we need to understand where people come from, and need to be compassionate toward that. We cannot dismiss that. We cannot say, well, this was 50 years ago, this doesn't happen now. This is the wrong attitude. Once we understand and we become compassionate toward that, we need to educate, and we need to have advocates like you reach out to communities and educate them as well. And it doesn't just have to be, Black advocates. It has to be advocates in combination with physicians to educate people and explain to them what these clinical trials are, because that's the only way we're going to go forward. Very simple.
And Julia and Sheila, and I know a lot of people in this conference have gone to San Antonio. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about the things you've done to really make your voices be heard. I don't know, Julia, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, so the doctor mentioned how research, as you develop research and create clinical trials and even do preclinical work, there's great benefit from working with patients and advocates all along the way, right? And having those conversations before the clinical trial opens, so that the exclusion criteria aren't asking for what Kelly Shanahan says, and it's one of my favorite terms, cancer Olympians, right? We want the real experience to be included in the development of all these trials and research projects. And I think real experience means patience, but it also means a very diverse set of experiences. So you need to not only include the one standard advocate. And in breast cancer, what we see is most advocates working on breast cancer are older, white, had breast cancer 30 years ago, and are wealthy enough to be able to do this on their own time and as a volunteer. So that's the voice that you get most of the time. That's the voice of the breast cancer patient. And I mean, that's definitely not us living with metastatic breast cancer. And it's not even the demographic of people that get breast cancer alone. So I think that's a big problem. And I think all of us have an obligation to say this. So the early stagers should be saying, I want metastatic voices included here. The young people should say, I want older voices included. The older should say, I want younger voices. And more importantly than anything, because of the big disparities we have in race, is white people need to be saying, I want the voices of Black people included in these conversations.
Thank you. I want to make sure I'm very attentive to the newly diagnosed women that are here today, because this is a lot and overwhelming. So Dr. Kaklamani, someone is asking, she's newly diagnosed, is progression a given? I just saw someone mention that, and I'm newly diagnosed.
The cookie cutter answer is that as of 2022, we have not learned how to cure metastatic breast cancer. Having said that, we have survivors that live for more than 10 years with the disease. And we have now survivors who don't have any sign of disease for 10, 15 years. So we probably do cure some women. So progression is not a given. Typically for metastatic breast cancer, at some point the cancer will grow. But this may be in a month, this may be in a year, this may be in 5 years or 10 years. So the way I look at it is, this is one of the unknowns of life. We don't know when we wake up in the morning that we're going to go to bed at night. We don't think about it, or people that don't have metastatic breast cancer don't think about it, but but this may very well happen. And so this is something that we can't control. We do the best we can, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future. Nobody does.
Thanks, Dr. Kaklamani. And I think that's a good segue into there's a variety of questions being asked by different people about when should a clinical trial be discussed? Should it be discussed when the disease grows and there's a disease progression? Should it be discussed at first? Should I switch? And I thought we could start this actually by just talking with Sheila and Julia. So we know, Sheila, that you didn't go into a clinical trial until you had been on a few different medications and had had some progressions. And Julia, can you share your experience? You have not been in a clinical trial before. Have they been offered to you? Can you just tell us a little bit about that and why this is important to you?
Yeah, so I have not participated in a clinical trial. I did get screened for one. So I had brain mets, and at some point did surgery to remove the metastasis in the brain. And they were testing this different type of scan. So it was not a treatment trial. It was a trial about whether this different PET scan can see tumor in the brain. And I was a perfect situation for this, because I was going to have surgery. So they could do the scan with their different dye and all of that. And then when they do the surgery, they check, was it what we thought it was with this new scan that we did? But unfortunately, the day that I was going to do the scan, they ran out of the dye or something like that. And my surgery was the next day. So missed opportunity. We did not do the trial. So I have... I think with my disease, there have been a few tried and proven treatments. So there was plenty of evidence that these were the best drugs for the specific subtype that I have at the time. And there was nothing at the time that was a better option than the standard of care. So yeah, no, I have never been offered a treatment trial.
Thanks for addressing that, Julia. And Dr. Kaklamani, I think it would be great for you to talk about. So Julia has HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer, where there are a number of different types of known treatments that work. So for people in that kind of situation, no matter what the subtype of cancer is, how do you make the decision about whether to offer a clinical trial if there's a known treatment that is effective in their type of cancer? At what point would you offer that?
So it really varies. What I typically like to do, and I definitely haven't figured out exactly what the right way is, and I think the right way depends on the patient, is when we talk about kind of our what's going to happen, what potentially will happen in the future, or what to expect, I will say, and by the way, I may discuss clinical trials with you. That's not a good thing or a bad thing. But I may bring it up if there's a trial available, and please do ask me as well. And some people are proactive. They'll ask me before I even have this conversation with them. And I think this kind of opens up the possibility of me mentioning it at some point. There's some, the truth is, even with HER2 positive disease, in the past 2 years, we've had 4 drugs approved in metastatic HER2 positive breast cancer. Why? Because of clinical trials. Our standard of care in the past 3 months in the first, second line setting changed dramatically because of a clinical trial. And so there's opportunities all the time. We have in our clinic, and I think most physicians do, a little cheat sheet where we have all of our clinical trials available. And so every time I see a patient, I kind of look at it and go, is there a trial that might be there available, for now or for the next few months? And then I kind of note it. I put a note in my notes so that I can remember next time. So the opportunity, if the opportunity is there, then we should discuss these trials with our patients. We do not want to bias ourselves by excluding patients that are eligible for a clinical trial, because then we get to what Julia said, a perfect patient population that was on a clinical trial that doesn't represent the patient that's sitting in front of me trying to figure out what to do with her life. And we don't want to do that. So as long as a patient is eligible for a clinical trial, it is and we have it open because we've agreed to participate and we believe in that clinical trial, it is our duty to discuss it with them.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing, Janine. So the drug that I'm on has been beaten by a newer drug. So if at the time I was put on this drug, the trial for this new drug existed, maybe that would have been the right thing to do.
Okay, so we're starting to run out of time, so I'm just going to try to keep talking fast. So Dr. Kaklamani, this is a more specific question, but someone is asking, if you're in a phase 3 trial and you're randomized to the control chemo arm and not the trial drug, but you're not able to tolerate the treatment, is it possible to cross over and get the trial drug as a compassionate use?
So crossovers exist in different trial designs, and that does not have anything to do with compassionate use. The compassionate use really has to do with a drug that we've already established that it works, but it has not been approved yet. And then the drug company makes a decision to make it available for patients. And it's very risky for them, because if any patient on this compassionate use drug gets any side effect that wasn't on the initial clinical trial, then the FDA is going to look at it and may decide to decline the drug. So it's a big risk for them to open up the drug for compassionate use as well. Sometimes if there's side effects that are, not well tolerated, then there's ways to decrease the dose, to hold the drug, to kind of watch, and the clinical trials will give us several days of rest before we have to take the patient off that clinical trial. So sometimes we have little tricks we can do to keep the patient on the trial, assuming that they're benefiting from that treatment.
Thank you.
And Jean, I'll just say one thing about the crossover. It's actually a concept that I learned more recently. And I don't know if maybe we should go into more detail, but even so, if a patient is on a control arm of a clinical trial and they have progression, there are trials that then allow them to get the actual drug, right? That feels so right to me. That is only fair for someone that is volunteering to be on a clinical trial, ends up on the control arm. There aren't that many people. Like a trial has like 1,000, 2,000 people. So it's not the cost. Why? I really struggle with this. Why doesn't every trial have this possibility?
Because we always love looking at overall survival. And our advocates will say, well, this drug's really not that good because it doesn't extend our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's very hard to prove that a drug extends the life of a patient if the patient on both arms receives that drug. And so for selfish reasons, most of these clinical trials don't include a crossover, but you're absolutely correct that it is our duty to do that. And then just say, you know what, if you don't see overall survival, it doesn't mean anything bad. It means that we gave the opportunity to patients that volunteered their bodies to give them a drug that they otherwise would not have received.
I'm not asking you to really fully answer this question, but maybe just give some direction. If someone is looking for trials specifically for triple negative, where would they go to look?
Clinicaltrials.gov. And please, when you do your search, print out that search and give it to your physician and have them cross the trials that are irrelevant, that may have become part of that surge, and circle the ones that they think are worth participating in.
I also want to add, because there's a lot of questions in the Q&A about specific types of breast cancer, that when we regather at 3:00 Eastern time, we're going to do sessions on each of the major types of metastatic breast cancer. And I think many of you, when you join those, you can get some specific answers to your questions about clinical trials. On lbbc.org as well, we have a metastatic trial search that is offered that can help match you to specific trials and that you can print out and bring to your doctor, as Dr. Kaklamani suggested. Jean, do you have another question?
I was just going to say that's a great point, because as much as I know for some people these searches are a little overwhelming and it's a lot of information, and I don't want to minimize that. So maybe you find a friend or a colleague or someone who really enjoys this to go on and do some research. But also the people in this conference, on this chat, you have so much expertise here. So, for those of you that have searched for trials that people are already dropping in resources. We don't want to minimize that. It's not simple, and there are exclusions. So you need help. But go ahead, Janine. I know we have 4 minutes.
Sure. Dr. Kaklamani, can you explain what some reasons are that people might be excluded from trials? Because obviously we have some folks here who have been frustrated in their efforts to be able to participate.
So each trial has inclusion and exclusion criteria, and they are extensive and difficult to interpret. The first criterion has to do with age. So in most cases, and I'm talking about metastatic breast cancer, we'll say 18-year-olds and older. Sometimes we'll say 18 to 70 or 18 to 75. And that's very frustrating and should not be happening in most cases, but it does. Then we look at, obviously, the kind of breast cancer that they have, where the cancer has spread to. Sometimes if it has only spread to the bones and not any other organs, because we can't measure it, we call it evaluable disease and not measurable disease. Some clinical trials will exclude those patients because they can't really assess very easily if the drug is working or not. Then we look at patients with brain metastases. Up until recently, every patient whose cancer had spread to the brain was excluded from clinical trials. It took very strong advocates to advocate for this to change, and it has. And now we include most, not every, but most patients with brain metastases on clinical trials. We then will say they need to have a life expectancy of at least 3 to 6 months. And it's either 3 months or 6 months. And again, that's really because we don't want to take patients that are so sick from their breast cancer that we can't assess if the drug is working or not, because it won't have enough time to show whether it's working or not. We look at blood counts. What is their liver enzymes? What are their red blood cells and white blood cells? And so you can imagine all of the list goes on and on and on. We've excluded patients with HIV for the longest time because, again, we don't want to be looking at patients that are not really doing well for other reasons and then not knowing if this drug is working for their breast cancer because they may be getting sick from HIV. That is kind of going away as well as HIV is becoming easier to treat. If it's an oral medication, we want to make sure that they can absorb it. So we want to make sure that their gastrointestinal tract is working properly. So it's an exhausting list. But each little line there is put for a reason, and in most cases a good reason, but in some cases not a very good reason.
Okay, Janine's going to add.
I'll just add one thing.
Go ahead.
Janine, I don't know if you were going to say this, but the brain mets exclusion, until the recent past, it was any brain mets. And now patients with brain mets are most of the time still excluding unless their mets are controlled.
Good point.
We're working on that.
Brain mets, yeah.
Yes. I think Janine's going to ask one final question, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Well, actually, I think Julia kind of teed it up really well, which is that these advocates have really been involved in trying to get more people with brain mets eligible for clinical trials. And so for our final question, I'd like to ask each of you just to speak briefly on how people with metastatic breast cancer as advocates can become more involved in changing the conversation around clinical trials. And why don't we start with you, Julia, and then we'll go to Sheila and Dr. Kaklamani.
I think advocates have to be included at all points of the process and at multiple times too. So it's not a one-time check-in. Can I get a letter of support and then I never see you again? It has to be a constant touch base with the patients, and this covers researchers, doctors, institutions, organizations like LBBC, or even the regulatory folks. They should be talking to patients, and they do. The NCI, I think at all levels, we should be including patients. And then for the patients that are interested in being involved in advocacy, it's everyone, like, you have to find your niche. Like, what is it that lights you up, you know? And then I think for each of us, there are things that we're really passionate about and that we get really into, and that's really what you should go after, I think.
Thank you, Julia. Sheila?
I'll piggyback off of Julia. It's just you have to find where your niche is. Because when I first started advocacy, I didn't realize there was research advocacy. Then there's, different kind of advocacy. And I was just like, okay, from reading grants for Medivivor to the DoD breast cancer research program, or even just calling when we send out something on Facebook, calling your congressional leaders to help change something that we need to change. You're being an advocate, even if it's just a 5-minute call. So just find, and not everybody wants to be an advocate. And I understand that. And, you just want to get on with your life, and that's okay. That's okay. But I will say, it fulfills my life. And I think that for me, my breast surgeon took an interest in me, and she introduced me to advocacy. So I'm blessed that she actually took me under her wing and said, this is what's happening. And I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. And then when I didn't see like other Black women and not many Black women at conferences, I was like, I got to do something. So it's probably the military in me, I guess. I don't know. But, just find your niche, and you don't have to be like all over the place. You could just pick one thing, or Living Beyond Breast Cancer, or Grabs, Julia, she's looking for people to mentor. We have her program has oncologists that will mentor you. Just find your niche and enjoy it. Be your own advocate. And I'm mad we didn't talk about informed consent in clinical trials, but maybe that's in that other session. But yeah, just find your niche, and whatever you do, love it.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And I'm sure our staff can put a link to GRASP into the chat so that everyone can learn about it, because we didn't have an opportunity to talk about it today. Dr. Kaklamani, I'd like to turn to you.
All of you, please remember, we serve you. We learn from you. We wouldn't exist if you didn't exist. And we are here to do the best for you. And so if you don't tell us what you need, what you want, what's important to you, then we can't perform the research that we need to perform to improve your care. So many things have come out of advocacy. And breast cancer advocacy, we're so lucky because we have so many of you that are just passionate about what's going on. And legislature, mammograms wouldn't exist and if we didn't have advocates, and all of our drugs. So we need you to be involved, and we need you to be vocal. And if you're not, and then what are we doing?
Well, you are all amazing. And Sheila and Julia and Dr. Kaklamani and all of you, I mean, reading this chat is incredibly inspirational. So I really want to thank you for being so open and honest and sharing your Saturday with us, and just making Living Beyond Breast Cancer so much better. And I think Janine's question is so important. How do you want to be an advocate? Remember, women chained themselves to the fences at Genentech to get Herceptin. So you don't have to do that, but there are so many ways that you can get involved. And it's so many people that have come before us that have really paved the way today. And I think it's just, no one wants this disease. Everybody wants to get through this. So everything you do does make a difference.